So I'm delighted that we're here today, and Rhia and I last year ran a session to get the debate going on this topic, and it's been fabulous this year to collaborate with Julie to share all our experiences and perspectives. And we're passionate about helping shape this agenda, and also excited to have this conversation and to continue it in the Holos community. Both, I suppose, acknowledging leadership consultants, but also from that perspective, but also from the perspective of leaders in business. And I think probably today we've got mainly people coming from a consulting perspective. But let's look at it from both perspectives, our clients and from ours. And there is lots of opportunity to help smooth the way for organizations and these millennials and Gen Zs, which is what we'll focus on today, and in order for them to work better together. And we believe it's a key issue for organizations to get their head around and act upon as part of their efforts to create successful, aligned, sustainable, future-proof businesses. And as for today's session, we're going to just run through quite a lot of facts. So it'll give you a real overview of the research and what we're seeing is happening. And we'll look at the implications for culture, leadership and talent management programs from a client perspective, I suppose, or from an organizational perspective. And how do we foster a sense of purpose? So we've picked out purpose as something that potentially could be interesting to look at for a way of engaging the whole organization, let alone millennials and Gen Zs. And then we'll go into a breakout, have some conversations in both areas, both purpose and recruiting, engaging and retaining. And then we'd really value sort of the discussion, I suppose, from that. So a quick intro. I realized this topic was missing on my agenda after living an experience with my 22-year-old. She was 21 at the time, daughter, and she started a work placement and had a year in industry. So imagine or picture a Gen Z working in a very conventional business in the food industry in the UK, in the Wirral. I've heard firsthand stories of disunity or a difference of views and opinions. And that's when I realized I really wanted to get more information, and maybe it was something which I was quite interested in, because I realized as well when I looked into it that it wasn't just Hannah that was the issue. It was a much bigger issue that seemed to be on a wider scale. So yeah, I really got interested in the topic, and I started a social enterprise in lockdown called Actus, which I'm delighted that Rhia is part of, and it was about helping Gen Zs actually make a difference and grow in their leadership in order to work better in the environment and ultimately to future-proof the workplace. So I'm going to hand over to Rhia. Is it right? Am I going to bring Rhia next?
I think it might be Julie first.
That's fine. Yes. So thank you all for being here. I'm happy to be here as well today. If you wouldn't mind, if you would open up your chat box and take a moment to put in there, what is it that interests you about this topic, or why did you decide to come to this session today? That would be great to type that in for us. And I know that we don't have time for detailed introductions, but in a minute after I'm finished, if you wouldn't mind, just say who you are. Most of us know each other here, but just a quick, who are you? Where do you live? Just real fast, that would be great. We will be in breakouts later and you'll have a chance to chat amongst yourself. So I'm Julie Compton. I live in the US. I'm in the Northwest. We have a lot of snow and a lot of flooding. So I'm kind of happy to be here online and not be in transit right now. I've been in the field of organizational development, one-on-one coaching, team coaching for 30 years in my own company. And I've spent at least 10 or so longer now with Neil and a lot of folks from Holos, and love to be a part of Holos. So My passion is moving people from A to B in whatever method I can do that in. But the attraction to Millennial Gen Z for me was two things. Number one, I have a lot of content after 30 years of doing a lot of work that I decided I needed to share with, starting with millennials. And I started doing some research into millennials a year ago and was asked by many millennials to start mentoring them. And that's kind of created some new avenues for my business. So long story short, I started researching millennials, and obviously then Lucy, Rhia, and I decided to collaborate on this topic. So that's a little bit about me. Before we go to Rhia, why don't we just quickly say, you know, who you are? That would be great. And where do you live? And then we see their interest in chat. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But Neil, almost everybody knows you, but give us your little headliner here. Start us off.
We're just south of London in a little village called Holmbury St Mary, which is right between Guildford and Dorking. And we haven't got any snow. We have kind of little tiny hills, and we live in the little tiny hills.
Thank you. And then his other half, she's here too.
Betty.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just correct Neil, because I do trail running. They are not little hills, they are enormous hills, okay, because I run in them every day. But
Yeah, but Julie lives in Idaho.
I know. I want to go running there too. Actually, I'm coming in.
That's great. Rob, what about you?
Yeah, I'm in West London in Hampton. I'm not near the Hampton Court Palace. I'm as far away from that as you can get. It's very flat here. It's lovely to cycle around.
Oh, good. Another cyclist. All right. And Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, I'm here in the UK too, northwest of London, just outside London, on the way to Oxford. I'm going to try and log in on the move. I've got to go and pick up my Gen Z from her activities, which I wasn't expecting. But I am going to try and stay on, but somehow be on the move. So I'll work that one out.
All right. Well, feel free if we can jump you. Sarah, have we met before? Where do you work?
I work for Liberty, the Liberty Group. Actually, we work a little bit with Neil, and I've worked a lot with Lucy in the past.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I see Richard.
Yes, joining from Chicago, where it's both noon and the sun is shining. We have no snow whatsoever. It's actually kind of lovely here today. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Russell's muted, so I'm not sure if he's in. We'll just think he's coming back in. So, well, let's keep moving. Thank you. The future is important. Yes, from your chat space. And what do we have with millennials and Gen Z? So I'm going to turn over to Rhia, who's going to give you her perspective for a little bit.
So hi everyone, thank you so much for joining. I'm here from southwest London. It is not sunny, it is cloudy, but hopefully at the end of this discussion we'll all be feeling a little bit more energized, as if there was some sun. So yeah, I'm Rhia and I'm going to be your Gen Z case study, I guess, for this session. I'm actually on the cusp between millennial and Gen Z. But a little bit about me. So when Julie was talking about her 30 years of experience, take away the zero, that's me. I graduated 3 years ago from King's College, and since then I've worn many hats, from business analyst, change management consultant, marketing consultant, yoga teacher, and recently puppy mum to my new little schnauzer, which is very exciting. So the reason that I'm here today is because I have noticed a growing gap between the organizations that my peers want to work for and the organizations that actually exist. And I'm sensing a lot of people like around me feeling really undervalued, underheard, disengaged. And I just think it's such a huge shame, because I personally believe that everyone has a skill or a talent that they can share with the world, and it's a missed opportunity for both parties if like this mismatch continues. So of course, today we're not going to dwell on those issues. We want this to be positive. So we're going to focus on those tangible actions that we can take to bridge this gap. So thank you for joining us on this journey. And yeah, without further ado, I will get into the facts. So a little bit about Gen Z and millennials. So if you are between the ages of 11 and 26, you will be part of Generation Z. And if you are a millennial, you'll be between the ages of 27 and 42. So if you just go to the next slide, please, Lucy. Right now, these generations make up around 38% of the global workforce. But within a few years, that's going to rise to greater than 58%. So if you're not part of these generations soon, you're going to be outnumbered, which is quite crazy. And then when it comes to general characteristics, there are some common themes between these two generations, although of course there are variations between and within. So firstly, they're value and purpose driven, and this isn't just the few lines on a website or an annual report. It's really not that. It's wanting companies to truly live and breathe their values and purpose, and feeling involved in that greater why or the greater purpose. Something that I often hear my friends talk about is a desire for their lives to mean something positive in terms of the work that they're actually doing. I feel like that organization is having a positive impact on the world rather than just creating financial growth for shareholders. The second thing is frequent feedback, clear expectations, and mentoring. Although this is more prominent with Generation Z. A recent study showed that I think it was 80% of Generation Z had the belief that failure was something to be learned from, which is obviously a very positive approach when it comes to mindset and when it comes to feedback. And in terms of the characteristics of that feedback, what's coming through is they're wanting short, clear, frequent, open, tangible feedback. And Julie will talk a little bit more about this when she goes into her focus group that she did. So another really big thing is having some autonomy over schedule. So I think over 75% of these generations prefer hybrid working, and interestingly 70% of Gen Z saying they would actually look for a new job if their company asked them to work in the office every day. And there are many reasons for this, ranging from like economic drivers, such as the cost of living crisis helps me save money. I'm not buying train tickets and food at the office, etc., etc. But also an emphasis on mental health and work-life balance, and wanting to have more time to focus on like self-care or seeing family and friends, and wanting to invest time in hobbies and perhaps monetizing those hobbies as well, which is another point that we'll get to. But I also think for a lot of people, hybrid work is really what they know for Gen Z. And I saw in a recent McKinsey article, they said Gen Z has never known a workplace that wasn't flexible. And that really resonated with me because I graduated in summer of 2020. My last semester of university was completely online. And then I went into the workforce and my whole of my first year was completely online. And then obviously the office opened, but since then it's been hybrid working. So for me, if I had to go into being in an office 5 days a week, that would be such a huge transition. Whereas, of course, people that entered the workforce way before COVID, perhaps that wouldn't be the case. But it's interesting to note, like,
it was terrible for us too. It was terrible back then.
Yeah.
A question from Rob. Did Deloitte compare these responses with other generations, Rhia? Do you know that? Maybe you don't know the answer to that.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think they did. I think they were pulling out the points of differences, or perhaps more emphasis on, perhaps not saying that other generations don't care about purpose and values, but it's the emphasis is coming through more in these generations. But I can also drop the link to the report here if that will help. So yeah, I'm just going to hand over to Julie now, because she actually did some of her own research, which you can quiz her about, on millennials and actually finding out what they care about.
Thanks, Rhia. I love Rhia's personal stories, and she has so many of them that she could have done this whole day by herself. So maybe we'll have some more time at the end. But so what I want to share with you is last year in November, I actually held a focus group for millennials, deciding to kind of do some of my own research. And it was fascinating to me to have a group of millennials sharing. And first of all, I will say they had no problem sharing. They really are, this group of folks were the high achievers, right? So these are people that are trying to make their way. They really want to grow in their career. So obviously there's a bias then for the information that you're going to get out if you have that kind of group. It was male and female. There were solopreneurs. There were also people working for large corporations and on their own, or hospitals. So variety of situations. So kind of the highlights, there was a lot of information that came out of this, including they're marrying later, they're spending more money, all kinds of interesting things on the side, but a little more geared to our topic today. First of all, something Rhia said already, they really do want to have a voice. A lot of them have the experience that they're dismissed for their age. At least that's how they feel. So if they're in a company and there's a room full of, let's just say 40-year-olds, their feeling of being, 34 or not as experienced is their, I guess, their personal agenda as to why they're not asked to be heard. And if they're with older folks, then they even feel more shut down, because it sort of comes across like, well, you don't know enough, you haven't done this for 25 years, right? And they feel that their voice may have an insight or an innovation because they think differently, which is kind of a deeper conversation we got into about creativity and innovation, and the fact that when they do have a voice, they actually see things from a different side. So not being dismissed is huge for them. Words really matter. So yes, it's important for them in this kind of, politically correctness that we've had over society over time with D&I and everything else happening, as well as inclusion being more than just gender, culture, etc. They're very careful about the words and how people are treated. And because their perception is they grew up very differently, they still have a hard time understanding why a 55, 60-year-old can't understand the he, them, she, her, they don't understand why it's hard for someone to grasp, right? Just makes sense that you should get it and use it. So it's fascinating to talk a little bit about the lingo side as well. Even from a marketing standpoint, when you're running a leadership training program, you want to use the lingo that attracts them. So I started asking them about lingo and what does that mean? And, they are attracted to using, in our term, we would call it slang or for the generation, but they actually want that in their business environment. They want to be able to use like the term badass or whatever it might be that's the lingo of their generation. Previously mentioned, and I can't say enough about having mentors and coaches. More than any generation I've seen so far, the millennials are hungry for mentoring, coaching. They don't have a pride factor. I even pushed a little bit on sort of the gender, stereotype of men and asked, how do you guys feel, right? And oh no, I'll take anybody, somebody who's been there, somebody who's famous, somebody who's not famous, older, younger, my age. I'll have 5 of them. By the way, most of them spend money on life coaches. It's just really interesting how taking help is like the norm and what they all want and where they spend money. I think that has a huge impact for us and when we think about learning and development. Second screen generation, no doubt, they do more than one thing at a time. Some of us may do. Raise your hand if you're guilty. How many of you have a podcast going and you're working on a project, right? However, these folks are second screen all the time. They're working in a large Fortune 10 company and they're second screening and their employers don't understand. And so it's sort of like, you can't do that. You're not focusing on work, but they can. So there's some disconnect when it comes to this. Also community driven. Obviously, they're very involved in community. If you watch social media and the growing social media, and you watch influencers on social media, you'll see that they almost all have a community. And if you have a community, then they're more likely to be involved and stay involved. So again, I think even in L&D, we have to start thinking about how to create mini communities within organizations for them to thrive. Video and mobile. Well, I don't know how many of you are aware, but YouTube launched into their video podcasting this year, and they're probably going to put Audible slowly out compared. Audible is attracting the generation of 50 and above who don't want video, and YouTube is attracting the millennials and below, because everything is all video based. So all the marketing for the future is video. TV advertising is dropping quickly because, you know, they're not watching it. There's just so many interesting facts about everything being video and mobile. Flexibility, remote, we've already covered. So I'll just say that, yes, very strong for them. They want flexibility in hours and timing, where to go, when to go. They want to work remotely when they can. But it's interesting, talking to the group that I had, the ones that are working for corporations, they enjoy and like the get-togethers. They want to fly every 2 months or 3 months to the corporate or some kind of community to get together with the people that they work with. And then the last piece, which is interesting, is there's quite a bit of mistrust with big brands. They just don't trust the brands that have been around a long time, especially if there's any kind of, at all political or, some kind of PR that wasn't healthy. They would much rather trust someone that is 30 years old, who may have 4 years of experience, but comes across authentic and has designed their life right, versus the big brand that's been around a long time and is huge and corporate and, come to us. They really have a mistrust for that. And they prefer that type of branding and those smaller orgs. So it's a fascinating look at what kind of influence do these large companies have if their brand has been hurt. Silicon Valley Bank is a perfect example in the US that just, I don't know how many of you are aware, but just on Friday it fell and closed. And that is a large, well-known venture capital banking bank. I've actually worked with Silicon Valley Bank. I haven't had a client there in a couple of years, but I've had 4 clients there. And San Francisco's in a big uproar now. Well, how do the millennials look at that, right? Just another bank that fell. And, this mistrust means they're creating these new online financial, types of technology and places to go. So I think there's an impact there, even when we think about hiring and retaining. So that leads us to the next slide, which is really about all this information is kind of, don't ignore this, right? What are we going to do? To your point in the chat earlier, like, why are you here today? Because it's the future and we can't ignore this. So how do we incorporate it? We don't have the answers individually, but I think collectively, if we keep sharing and talking, we can get to more answers. So a couple quick highlights from what I'm talking about here is that if we have the majority of millennials and Gen Z not engaged at work, right, we have an issue. Now, obviously, we've had engagement problems before in past generations. We've used surveys, et cetera, to figure that out. But this is important because millennials are also doing other things. Next slide. They are facing a situation now where they have in their mind more options, right? So if millennials and Gen Z, if they do feel empowered, you can see the difference of them staying versus leaving, right? And they stay when they're empowered. Again, not a surprise given any generation needs to be empowered in order to stay. But the difference is millennials and Gen Z, they say it's okay for me to leave, right? Baby boomers, it wasn't okay. In fact, it was terrible to leave every 3 years. You were job hopping. You don't dare do that if, so the values are different. They're looking out for themselves and their careers. And it's the company's problem if they're not going to do this. I'm going to do this for myself, right? So it's a very different viewpoint. And then if they're not heard, you can see the stats here that 47 of millennials and 54% of Gen Z, if they're not heard, they leave within a year. And that is definitely something that my millennials had no problems agreeing with and saying, yeah, we'll do that. So what's happening is also really fascinating, this quiet quitting, which we're experiencing in many ways, but also performing 2 or more jobs. So a quick story. I have a client in a Fortune 10 company, and they noticed a couple of their employees were not as engaged. They weren't performing as well. They were engineers. And so they sat down with both of them separately to find out what was happening. And one of them just said, I'm tired, I'm exhausted. The other one said, frankly, I'm not that engaged in the company right now. I'm not really liking how I'm being treated. So they tried to do some things to help these two. And then it just so happened, out of a surprise, a month later, this woman got a call from another company, and they said, hi, we're calling about so-and-so to try to get a reference. And she says, reference for what? And they said, oh, he applied for a job. And she said, well, what job? It's an engineering job, full-time job we have open. And the light bulb went off, and she realized that this employee is actually interviewing for another company. So long story short, she did some digging. What she found out is employee number 1 was working 2 jobs as an engineer for 2 different companies, both full-time. So this employee had 2 40-hour jobs, and what he was doing is working approximately 25 to 30 for each company and delivering less and bringing home a double paycheck, right? So she looked into that and then found out the second employee found out about him doing that. So he was job hunting, and that's how that reference call came in. So here's a perfect example of what's starting to happen. And again, this doesn't mean it's the norm, but it means that, like my focus group, my folks also, from a good value standpoint, were working real estate, working their own jobs online, and working for a company. And they didn't have any problems doing all of this, right? So why are they looking for so many things? There's a lot of reasons, right? Up on the screen, we're showing you some of the drivers for what they're doing. The freelance work, I think, is the last part I want to settle on before I turn it over to Lucy. But there's such a growing business in freelance, as you all know. If in the US, we use Indeed plus a lot of other sites for freelance work. And I ran across this statistic, but I can't find the source. But I think it's something like 35% of people now are starting to drop out of the workforce and would rather engage in the freelance work through these sites, or through their own content creation and creating their own sites. So we're changing. And if we don't figure out how to engage, retain, meet the needs of this generation, I think we're going to have continued job openings. At least here in the US, we have so many job openings still, even amongst our economy, which isn't doing so great. So food for thought. We'll come back in breakouts in a bit, and we'll have some great discussions. But one more piece of the pie is what Lucy's going to talk about, which is purpose. So I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thanks, Julie. So yeah, I think what I wanted us to kind of look at here was to look at the perspective of purpose from Gen Z and millennials, but also potentially to look at it, or definitely to look at it as something which could engage everyone in a business. So yeah, I just wanted to think of it from that perspective, so more broadly. And just a few stats looking at Gen Z's millennials, and that just kind of picks out purpose from the Deloitte 2022 study. And, you know, nearly 2 in 5 millennials and Gen Z say they rejected a job because of its personal ethics. That just follows obviously the pattern of what we've been saying and what Julie's found in her focus groups by talking to, you know, high talent young leaders. And nearly 1 in 2 millennials, Gen Z in senior positions have rejected job assignments for personal ethics reasons. And that all goes back to, you know, the point again that Julie was making about people's skepticism about certain brands. If they don't have the right ethics, they're not going to buy those brands. So just because they might be desperate for that product or something, they'll find another one which is more ethical. And obviously you've got the emergence of B Corps, and, you know, so that's obviously a massive area. So yeah, just interesting there, that's those statistics. There's obviously a bigger piece here in all the other stats, but I wanted to us to observe the one specifically that looked at I derive a sense of meaning from my work. Again, millennials and Gen Z, slightly more millennials than Gen Zs, but still a big piece there. A quarter of, you know, those people wanted a greater sense of meaning and purpose from their work. And that's something, a number of the other things are more about work-life balance and the way things are done and what my contract is, and the culture. And clearly culture is key around purpose too, but purpose is something that potentially could be something that business can do that's more concrete and material to engage people. So, and this, I just wanted to put this stat up as well, just to observe that when graduates were asked, only 15% would prefer to work for large corporates, and that is definitely to do with ethics and, you know, why the business exists, what it really stands for, the culture of that business, how they, you know, what's it like to work there. So again, just, I suppose, supporting all the evidence that we've already talked about. And then just this statement here from the McKinsey report in 2021, purpose has the power to transform in a world where, according to this statistic, although earlier on I did hear a statistic that was slightly less than that, but this is amazing, 85% of people, forget millennials, Gen Zs, there's 85% of people, according to this study, that the people that were interviewed who are actively disengaged in their business, to one, potentially, if they get it right, to one where millennials and Gen Z seek out bigger companies, where currently there's, you know, only 15%. And it's the norm for people to be proud and energized at work. So some things to consider there, I suppose. And what we wanted to do was to have a good amount of time for discussion. So we were going to do a couple of breakout groups around this, but do you think we should do 2? Okay.
Yeah, we're still going to do 2, so people can go into a topic and then we can come back.
Okay, let's see what people's where people's energy is in terms of topics. So we want to just look at, given that purpose has the power to engage millennials and Gen Zs, what can organizations and leaders do to leverage this? Let me just put the briefs up that we kind of wanted you guys to consider. So take a read, see what you think. If we break out into 2 groups, means 2 or 3 people in a group, which one takes your fancy? And you can self-nominate. I think, have you set up the groups?
I've set up the groups already, and they're self-nominating.
Yeah, so let's see what happens. How do people feel? What do people want to discuss? And then, you know, 15 or so minutes, and then come back and let's share in the discussion what you discussed, because that'll be a very rich, I think, conversation.
So the first one was we don't see evidence of this very strongly in our clients. Our clients are failing in this area. I too much, I suspect. And of course, part of the problem is that we tend to deal with older people within the client organization anyway. So we don't generally, even if they have younger people, we're not generally exposed to them. But when I wrote my first two books, I was interviewing people running businesses, and there was no doubt at all that people were engaging more with those organizations because of the purpose that they stood for. And to bring that more up to date, because I wrote those some time ago, there was the Tesla Investor Day presentation 2 weeks ago, and in spite of all of the controversy, Tesla is still attracting no shortage of highly talented young engineers because of their purpose and because of people's belief in that purpose. So I think there is plenty of evidence, and what makes it successful is that it's for real, and that it's genuinely serving something that at least a population believe is for the greater good. It's not, it doesn't necessarily need to attract everybody, but for those who believe in it, it needs to work for them. I think to some extent that answers the second question, which is it has to be systemic. Slogans are not enough. It has to genuine, people have to believe it. And I'd be really interested to go back to the Deloitte survey or one of those surveys and say, some companies that you were brought in by the slogan and then found out that the slogan didn't have integrity, what happened then? I think that would be very interesting. And then we got on to the third question, which we thought was a bit unfair in a 12-minute breakout to throw the toughest question in at the end. So for those of you who weren't in our session, what can L&D or HR do that is innovative with technology to better connect this generation to purpose in the organization? And I think that the best that we could come up with was that there's something about using the technology to continually have that conversation about how are we interpreting our purpose and how are we manifesting our purpose, and giving people voice, and whether that's through video and making use of that video, making that video public, and really giving people a platform to discuss purpose and the reality of purpose, I think was the best we could come up with at the time.
Sorry, can I add one thing to that?
Yes, you can.
And what we also talked about was this whole thing about making brands into communities. So you're allowing the technology to, as you say, to make it a platform for people, but so that they can co-create that vision, they can co-create that brand, and the brand has to be the culture, but not because outside consultants have told them the brand is the culture, but because they're continually co-creating it from within. So
yeah,
that's what we got to.
That's great. Good discussion. Thank you for that. And I think there's some similarities with our room as well. And for the sake of time, I'm going to say, Tessa, why don't you throw out a couple of your insights?
Oh, do you want me to speak to it?
Yeah.
We were talking about the idea of active listening. So Rhia gave an example of a boss that started and came in and he spoke to each individual person. And I think, what we've heard is that they want to be listened to, they want to be heard, and they want their ideas to be incorporated. And this idea of active listening, so it's whether it's one-on-one or one-on-many, is quite important. We also talked about apprenticeships and internships as also being really important to, to foster not only their talents, but also foster their skills or grow their skills. So Rhia was talking about, having a mentor that's not necessarily around, showing you the political landscape of a company, but teaching you a skill to enhance one's own abilities within that organization. So those were a couple of the ideas that came out.
Yeah, that's great. And we also talked about, go ahead, Rhia.
Sorry, Julie. Oh yeah, I was just going to say that it really followed on from Neil, what you said about giving people a voice, because we also, as you said, about active listening, shadow boards, and changing our mindset around feedback, and trying to really foster that feedback rich culture, and kind of just accept the fact that in general the younger generations do want more consistent, frequent feedback, whereas Judy, you said you had a client or something that kind of struggled to fully accept that, but it's about changing mindset. So I just wanted to add that.
And the idea of a shadow board is also very interesting. If you think about, so my son was interviewing at a school recently here in South Africa, and he met the headmaster, and the headmaster said, well, I've got a student board that I refer to and I talk to. So almost have a board of Gen Z millennials that actually really infiltrate the organization in a very positive way.
And actually, on that point, I guess, Neil, as a business owner yourself, what are you doing to move the dial forward on this and kind of...
Thank you very much for asking. I was actually going to ask for a moment to do that, because I think this group is really important in that. So, I mean, we one of the things that frustrates me enormously is we don't teach leadership to young people routinely unless you join the military. And therefore a lot of people, I mean, people don't know how to lead. And I think the first thing that we would like to do is to set up a way of teaching leadership for free to 20-somethings. So at the moment it sort of feels like it's sort of 6 sessions over a year or something, or over 6 months, something like that, where we could do that. But I think that would be a really great place to start. And I think actually the idea of that then feeding into a shadow, I mean, not that we have a board to shadow, but that of it feeding into some kind of shadow setup. I think shadow is not a very good word, is it? No,
it's not shadowing. Yeah, it's shadowing. Yeah,
but the people's shadow side, that's not positive.
Well, I was going to jump in. I know. So just another quick thought. So on that avenue of teaching young people, I made an arrangement with my daughter's high school, her student council class, because my daughter's president of the high school. I'm now going in once a month for an hour all year to talk about leadership. And what is it really? And like last week, we talked about knowing yourself and how you have to begin with knowing yourself. And we did like a disc type, exercise. But any way that we can think about how do we get younger people to really start understanding leadership, high school up, to impact these generations and our future,
I'd be interested in your experience, because I did a session with 16-year-olds and they actually struggled. They were a bit too young.
Yeah, mine were great. They were seniors though. So.
Okay, I think there's a tipping point somewhere, isn't there?
So
I just want to say, sorry.
Go on. No, go on.
I just want to say really quickly that if you think about the qualities of what Gen Z and millennials are looking for, the kind of work that we offer as a company, as Holos, and the kind of values that we hold are very, very on par with what that generation wants.
Yeah.
Freedom, flexibility, doing something with purpose.
Tessa, I'll challenge that and say I think we're close to being on par. But to Neil's point, we should have a board made up of millennials and Gen Zs who are going to let us know if we're on par and be a part of creating our future, right, Rhia?
Totally. Absolutely.
So I know, Rhia, you're absolutely spot on. So how does that sound to you? I mean, does that sound absurdly?
I was going to say, let's ask Rhia, and you're part of Actors, Rhia, so we should have a conversation, Neil, because I want to broaden what I'm doing. And what's your experience of Actors, i.e. being a part of a group where you're doing leadership and talking about leadership, Rhia?
Yeah, so first of all, that is great to hear, Neil. It's like we're all making our pledges of I will do this, I promise to do this, and actually, take these learnings forward and do something about it. As this says, if you want to create change, you have to do things different and not just do lip service. So I think that is great. I think as well, because younger generations, of course older ones are, but if I think about all my friends, like really concerned about cost of living. So the fact that you are offering it for free as well is a big thing, because I know that a lot of my friends are really interested in self-development, like, and really want like a life coach, and they really want to go to courses and to upskill and learn how to do things better. But then it's like, oh, but it costs X, Y, and Z. And so having that it made more accessible is such a great thing. And then to Lucy's point around actors, that has been amazing in terms of being surrounded by people around my age, but also learning from you, Lucy, and having people come in to talk to us and just bounce ideas off one another. I think the first thing is asking the question, asking our opinion, and then going from there. So I think anything that starts from that point is definitely a great start.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Rhia. I know we have to wrap up. I'm just going to end all of our conversation with one main thought, which is, I think we're all on the same terms, is that our organizations are falling behind in this area. Rob spoke nicely to the fact that he's seen some pretty quick failures happening here. And I too do not see leaders understanding the new expectation of them, for example, giving feedback. And so overall, the biggest question is, how do we individually start impacting organizations and the culture so they start to incorporate what it is that millennials and Gen Zs need and want? And there's a bigger dialogue here that we can't solve today, but we just appreciate your engagement and being here. And for those of you we don't see, thank you for being here. And hopefully we'll have some more ideas to share and some things coming up. If you have any suggestions for what Holos could do, please feel free to send an email, get a hold of Neil or any one of us. And thank you all for being here.